Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Nathaniel Rich, who has just been named Associate Editor of the Paris Review. He's the author, most recently, of San Francisco Noir, the city and film noir from 1940 to the present. Nat, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born and raised in New York City, in Manhattan. Grew up there, went to college nearby, and lived in Brooklyn for a year and a half before moving to San Francisco, at which point I began work on the book.
And let's go back a minute. Looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world before you went off to college?
Well, I certainly, with reference to this book, I was raised by two parents who loved film, especially my father, and I was constantly watching movies and watching film and going to places like Film Forum and art house cinema type venues from the point, since I was very young, and watching a lot of Hitchcock especially. Also, both of them work in the literary industry and newspapers, and also a publishing company. So I also came up with that in that world, and so it seemed a natural thing to go into writing and journalism and editing, which was nice. And many other people I know in the business don't come from that kind of background, and it's more difficult. But they've always been very encouraging and accepting of that.
And when you would, the family would read a book or see a film, would the discussion around the dinner table or in the living room be about what made this a great work of art or a great film, even at a young age for you?
I think so, absolutely. Or even if there wasn't a discussion pointing out, the finer critical points of why Vertigo is an excellent film, just the very fact of being exposed to a lot of these films and older films, black and white films, which seemed ancient when I was growing up. It just made me think about film in a different way, and with literature, I suppose I did talk about books with my family, but it was never a kind of rigorous homeschooling atmosphere. It was just my parents would buy me books that they liked and that their parents had liked, and so I came up reading that way.
And did you go to high school in New York City?
I did. I went to Dalton High School in New York.
Mm-hmm. And did you have any teachers there who inspired your literary and cultural bents?
Well, I had a few excellent English teachers. My favorite teacher was actually a geometry teacher from Germany, and so that didn't inspire me in any clear way.
I see.
But I'd say more once I got to college was when, I was editor of the newspaper in high school, and I was always interested in writing critically and doing creative writing as well, but it probably wasn't till college, really the first year of college, where I began to think about this as something that I might actually want to do.
Mm-hmm. And what, in this period of, say, high school and then into college, we'll talk about college in a minute, what were there any events that really affected you, national events that made you bring gave you an interest in politics? Because there's some political themes in this book, which we'll talk about
Absolutely.
in a minute.
Yeah, well, my father is very much involved in politics, and probably the elections. Growing up, the elections were always a very big deal, and I would get very excited to watch the returns come in, and I talked a lot about politics with my father especially. And as far as national public events, the one thing I can really think of was the OJ trial when I was in 9th grade, and mostly because it interrupted the NBA Finals at the time, and I was a Knicks fan, and so it was a disaster to not be able to watch, this, Game 3 or 4 against the Rockets, and put a damper over the rest of the series, which they lost. But there weren't. I can't really point to a specific incident or moment that really altered my way of thinking, but it was more of a gradual process, and especially through college, to come to my interests in film and literature and politics as well.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Yale.
Yeah, and there you majored in English or cultural studies?
I majored in literature, which is like the English major, except there's less of a focus on the canon, and it allows you to read works in translation, which is something I really wanted to do, and to focus on a foreign language and read books in that language, and I did Italian, and became obsessed with Italy that whole time. So it's basically the equivalent of comparative literature in other colleges.
And were you part of the film society? Did you write movie reviews when you were in college?
I didn't write much film criticism, but I certainly attended all of the film showings, the film society, and took a couple of film classes. And I've always tried. I took some film classes actually over the summer during high school at one point. Film is always something that I felt comfortable talking about and writing about, and understanding as well as I can. So part of the literature major, that one thing that distinguishes it from the English major is that it also allowed me to take film courses that would qualify for the major and study them as texts in a way. And so I always saw literature and film as really part of the same world, and politics often as well. It's all mixed up together.
And why do you think you found film a kind of attractive medium to be thinking about? What was it, a generational thing? Because you obviously come from a generation where the visual media have really exerted an enormous influence, or
absolutely.
Or
well, I think that was part of it. Most of the films that, one thing I remember is when Pulp Fiction came out, I was about 14 or 15, and that was the first film, contemporary film, that I had seen that really excited me and made me think about film in a way beyond just whether I liked it or not. And since then, I was very interested in, I began to become interested in certain contemporary directors and started to see in them interesting things and ties to previous generations of directors that I had seen as I was growing up. And so in that sense, yeah, and the other thing is that certainly many people my age, when they who are creative, tend to go into film now, and I'm especially seeing that now that we're in our mid-20s, and a lot of creative people and writers tend now to go into film instead of literature, so I think it's certainly, the interest is definitely part, there's a generational aspect to that as well.
So help us understand what a film critic does. What does he do? We all go to movies, we all enjoy them, or dislike them intensely. We all think about, well, no, not all of us. Some people think about them and they don't wind up becoming critics. So what makes critics special when they write about film? Is it that they put it down on paper and get it published?
Possibly. I don't know how special they are, but and I can only, my experience as a film critic really is limited to, and being published as a film critic is really limited to this book. So I can only speak from my limited experience, but one thing that I tried to do was to explain what a director was trying to convey, what kind of points they were trying to make, try to understand what traditions they were working in. With this book, that meant laying out a lot of history of how film noir came about, what kind of filmmakers were interested in making film noir, their background. There were a lot of, for instance, emigres from Germany and Austria, and you see that in a lot of these films as a German expressionistic style that comes out of a lot of German and Austrian films from the 30s and earlier. So I think it's trying to introduce the film to a reader and trying to convey what the experience of watching that film is like. And I think as to making a judgment about whether it's a good film or not a good film, I think that it should be secondary. And that ideally, and this is true of any kind of arts criticism, I believe, is that the role of the critic is to convey accurately what the experience is of watching this film or play or reading a book, to explain where it's coming from. And if he or she does a good enough job, the reader or viewer should be able to tell whether or not they would like it, regardless of what the critic thinks. Mm-hmm. So I tend to enjoy criticism that makes interesting points about works of art, and rather than the thumbs up, thumbs down, which tells you very little except for the critic's personal taste. And many of the films I included in the book are films that are not very good, and I think are often pretty silly in some cases. But I still wanted to explain what was interesting about each one and why they were worth talking about, even if they were bad.
We'll get to the book in a minute.
Sure.
I should show it, San Francisco Noir, and we'll talk about it in a second. But since you mentioned it, but let me ask you one other general question. Sure. Before we get right to the book, and that is, what do you see as distinctive about film as an art form? You've worked in literature. You come from a cultivated background in which people were talking about, different aspects of culture, literature, drama, and so on. So is there something special about film that, even though you're just starting out, and with one book under your belt, that helps us appreciate the medium, and maybe also tells us why you were so drawn to it?
It's a good question. I think there's something intangible about the experience of going to a movie theater and having the lights turn out and the film start playing. And there's something about that experience that maybe I associate with very happy early, young experiences when I was very young. But I enjoy it as just another art form, another way of putting across creative ideas. And I think what's interesting about it, as opposed to literature, which is my other main interest, is that it's really such a collaborative effort. And even when you have directors who are serious auteurs and control as many aspects of the production as possible, there's so much collaboration going on and compromise and interactions between different artists, whether it be cinematographer or set design, actors, director. And so I think there's something that becomes a little bit out of any one artist's control with films, where in a novel, a masterful writer will really control every aspect of it. And so I think there's something else going on in film, like other collaborative arts, that separates it from that. But that's probably the closest I could come to.
Yeah, and I guess it's also that it's a product that has to, through this collaboration, make it in the marketplace, right?
Right.
I mean, because that's the goal. That's how you get to the shot at the hoop, so to speak.
Absolutely, and I think that's one thing that's interesting about certain genre films, because they're made in mind. Especially many of these films were made to make a profit, and that was very much the goal of a lot of these films. Unlike, maybe a Godard film or other art house films, these films were made to make a profit. So it's often interesting to see, and that's another collaboration between the producers and the studio who is funding the film and wants a sellable product, and the artists at work who, they also might just want to make a lot of money. But that's another, I think, interesting compromise that takes place, and it's always fascinating to me to see how directors go about finessing that relationship and trying to make something has artistic merit as well as something that's profitable.
Now let's move to the subset of films that you're looking at in this book. And the first important thing about this universe is that they're film noir. When were film noirs made, and what are their defining features? You hinted at it earlier, but let's be more explicit about what they are.
Often the genre, although some people would dispute using the term genre, but I think it's easier to use it, is often said to have begun 1941 with The Maltese Falcon, and the classic period of noir is defined as 1941 to 1958, roughly. And these are all films that are shot in black and white, have expressionistic style, very clear stylistic aesthetic, stark black and white, often oblique camera angles, and a style that creates a sense of uneasiness and even paranoia at times, very uncomfortable expressionistic style. Then it's also, and so some people would define film noir simply as films that are made from this period, 1941 to 1958, in this style. Another argument argues for content. Mm-hmm. And the content of a film noir, the basic plot line tends to be a hero, an anti-hero, down on his luck in an American city after the war, who gets drawn into some kind of elaborate mystery or conspiracy by a seductive woman, usually the femme fatale, and is caught up in this conspiracy and trying to figure out how to get out of it and who's trapped him. And there's usually a murder involved, almost always a murder involved, and there's a sense that no matter what he does, by the end he'll be doomed and taken up by this monster. For me, I don't think either one is exactly the full picture. Most of all for me, and this is a more broad definition, I thought of film noir as more about tone. And the tone that I think all of these films share is a tone of dread. And so it's this sense that everything is going to go badly no matter what happens. And it's going to end usually with a bullet. And mm-hmm. so using that definition, you can move to the next era, which is from 1958 to the present, really. And those years, films made during that time are considered neo-noir. These are films that are often shot in color, but try to stylistically approximate the same kind of effect that was achieved in black and white, but using color. And this takes on many different forms, often using lots of shadow or often using strange colors, things like that. And many of these films stray from the typical noir formula, especially the typical noir plot and conventions, and often focus on one element or one theme. For instance, a film like The Conversation focuses on paranoia, mm-hmm. and it takes that theme to an exaggerated level, usually. And so often neo-noirs resemble film noirs in one aspect, but then ignore the rest of it and take that one theme to an obsessive level. And then there are other films, more recent films, that are similar to classic noirs, just in the sense that they are nostalgic for them, and they're almost like homages to these earlier films. So it's a broad genre. Everyone has their own definition. Many of the books on film noir don't actually give any kind of clear definition of the genre, but simply list all the films that they consider to be film noir, and that's their definition. Mm-hmm. So I tried to define it as this tone of dread, and I think that most of the films that I've included, or all of them, have that in common.
You pointed out that some of the directors and the writers had European origins, and the films reflect the influence of German expressionism in film, like movies, I should say to the audience, like M with Peter Lorre and, sure. and the Cabinet of Dr. Kilgary, which go back. But I'm curious about something, is how this foreign influence, that is this cosmopolitanism, these people who came from Europe and brought those styles, interfaces with what there is in the American ethos that right. makes these films popular here in the United States. Talk a little about that, because was it that the U.S. reached a certain level of development and urbanization and uncertainty? Are we talking about the war years? What are we talking about that enabled this mingling of cosmopolitan with a kind of elements of the national ethos to make this click for an American market?
Right. Well, it really came out of the war, World War II, and noir is really about the American city. And in those years, the big American cities, where most of these films were shot, LA, New York, and San Francisco, were symbols of progress and expansion and success and the boom, the post-war boom, and noir came along to say maybe everything isn't quite so great as we all think it is. Maybe not everyone's doing so well. Maybe there's something more sinister going on, at least underneath the surface. And noir is very much about what's underneath the surface, the underground, the underbelly. And so it might very well be that it took foreign filmmakers to be able to see that and to have a criticism of the country that they had moved to, and maybe they were a little more skeptical of the excitement and the boosterism of those years. And really that's the classic noir period, I think, is really about that, is subverting that kind of American triumphalism and saying that something isn't quite right after all.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this mix, you point out that the genre, let's call it a genre for sake of discussion, that there you can see an evolution in these films, not just from black and white to color and the narrowing of a focus, which you discussed earlier, but historical themes that were emerging. I recall that you talk about the influence of the detective film and writing, moving on to the fear of communism. Talk a little about that. I think it's an important
well, there were many strands of noir and subgenres. One was certainly the Red Scare noirs, which is a hilarious subset of about half a dozen films that where the enemy becomes not the hoodlum or the gangster or the tough guy, but the commies. And so and the good guy is the American FBI agent. And so there are a couple of films like I Married a Communist and Walk a Crooked Mile that use that model. But really the way I think about how noir evolved had a lot to do with how the American city itself evolved in those years. And by the time you get, for instance, to the 70s, many of these cities were becoming decrepit, and the underworld was the world of these cities. And films like Dirty Harry or Bullet or Point Blank, which are all late 60s to early 70s, the city is now decayed, and so it doesn't make sense anymore to talk about an underworld or to have this contrast between the surface and the underbelly, but the violence is out in the street. And so the films reflect that in interesting ways and become very different. The most famous scene in Dirty Harry is where he's eating a hot dog. Clint Eastwood character, Detective Harry Callahan, is eating a hot dog in this seedy restaurant in basically downtown San Francisco, and he detects that a bank robbery is going on in the middle of the day across the street, and there's an explosion, and it's the scene where he goes out and asks him if he feels lucky. But there it's interesting because it's in the middle of the day, it's a business day, there are hundreds of people all around, cars are driving by, but the violence is part of everyday reality, and the grittiness that was once sought for in the underground is now everywhere, and the pedestrians aren't too surprised by it. They're screaming, but the cars just keep driving by and so on. And so I think oftentimes the changes that came about in the genre came about because of changes in the American urban situation. And there are a couple of books that are more scholarly books that are focused exactly on this question.
That's interesting that you mentioned the Clint Eastwood, because it was one of the films previous night. The American Film Institute did the most famous quotes in that. There were several scenes, and I can see very much what you're describing, because I just saw the scene. But your explanation of your justification for moving from the black and white to the color films such as The Conversation and Dirty Harry and Final Analysis and the others, the point is well taken, because in other words, so the the terror or whatever is this anxiety is kind of not in a closet anymore. It's sort of come out and been printed out.
Yeah, and it's assaulting you. And I think a good example of the ways that directors used color in interesting ways, trying to approximate the black and white, is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, directed by Phil Kaufman, which many people consider a science fiction picture, a horror film. Mm-hmm. But Kaufman, I think, was very much working from a noir, coming out of a noir tradition, and the plot itself is like any noir, where there's a down on his luck hero becomes aware or suspicious that there's some kind of big conspiracy underfoot, tries to figure it out, sense that he's going to be destroyed by it. And the way Kaufman uses the color is very interesting, because he uses lots of very strange greens and purples, mm-hmm. and lots of shots surrounded by shadow. So there's a sense that everything is a little bit off, and that in the shadows outside the frame there's something lurking, and there are pod people lurking there. Mm-hmm. So,
and this was actually a remake of an earlier film, which can't be included in your collection, right, because the earlier film, Kevin McCarthy was running to the streets of L.A., I guess. He was going south instead of north.
Yeah, right. It's not, they moved it up to San Francisco.
Yeah, so it couldn't be in your film, which raises the next topic that we have to discover, because your book is not just about film noir, but it's about San Francisco and San Francisco in film noir. And as I recall in the introduction, you actually explain to us what provoked you to write this particular book, and tell us about that day when you made a comment about San Francisco, which someone reacted negatively to. Tell us a little.
Well, I always wondered why there were so many of these films shot here, and whenever I would mention the idea for the book and the title of the book to friends and people who lived in San Francisco, they'd often be shocked, because to them and to many people, San Francisco is one of the cheeriest, happiest, most romantic cities in the world, and the thought of anything sinister going on doesn't really make sense to them, and there's some truth to that. But I think that's part of the reason why so many of these films were shot here, because it goes back to the original classic era of noir, when that you wanted to have a strong contrast between the outer world, the glamorous world, and the underworld. And there's no city that is as beautiful and happy and glamorous as San Francisco, I think, in many ways. And so thereby the contrast between that and the underworld is all the more dramatic. And I think that was part of the reason why many of these filmmakers decided to shoot here, because in some ways it was the perfect model for noir, to show corruption, that even in this place that resembles a paradise, there is this very sinister thing going on underneath, and that no one's safe from it. And I think that's part of the reason why Kaufman moved Body Snatchers up to San Francisco too, is because maybe you can imagine L.A. It wouldn't be such a stretch to imagine that everyone there is a pod person, but in San Francisco, maybe there's something. Then something must really be wrong, if everyone...
Here it would have something to do with biotechnology.
Right, exactly. They engineer them themselves.
In the mind. So then is it, so what, okay, so there's this contrast between beauty and the underworld, but also it must have to do with the topography of the place, and the hills and the rise and the fall of the landscape.
Sure,
and so on.
Yeah, the topography certainly gives itself to these stark camera angles, and naturally the city has all of these expressionistic almost lines in the environment, and I think that was part of it. I think proximity to Los Angeles is also a factor, but for me, but at the same time, I don't think that's everything, because there weren't any films made in San Diego, for instance, and Seattle is a very hilly city, but you don't see many films shot there. I think it has mostly to do with the image of San Francisco as this beautiful, almost paradise city by the bay, and then there's also a historical element that ever since its days, since the gold rush era as the Barbary Coast, it was a place where people would run away to, would go to start anew, often in search of fabulous riches and wealth, and people would change their identity. And I think that all those themes are very crucial to film noir, so it fits there as well. So I think it was a convergence of all of these factors: the historical, topographical, and the image of this beautiful city.
There's one element that strikes me, which I'll raise now, which is the San Francisco's potential for the exotic. Because I happened, as I told you earlier, to watch The Lady from Shanghai, which is one of the movies that you discuss, and there is this sinister tone that comes from the Asian influence. She is a woman who lived in Shanghai, but who also has a driver who is Asian, or at least she works and at a turning point in the film, Orson Welles flees to the Asian community. And if you think of Vertigo, the first time I saw it, I was really struck by the the Spanish influence that Hitchcock was both playing with. The mysterious Carlotta, has a Spanish background, and then there is the mystical element, which is also present, whether she's Carlotta is still alive. I guess what I'm suggesting is that as a crossroads, with this beautiful landscape, for all the reasons that you've given, but in addition, San Francisco is open to these cosmopolitan influences, and that presence can be seen in a lot of these films, actually.
Absolutely, and I think the film that features that the most is a very obscure film called Chinatown at Midnight, which begins with clips, as many of these films, by the way, do, and especially the ones in the 40s and 50s, begins with panorama of San Francisco, and then zooms in onto one particular part of the city, and then into the underworld, really. But in this film, the underworld is Chinatown, and so there's this ridiculous voiceover by a man who's first introduces you to the city and how beautiful the city is and the trolley cars and so on. But then within this city, there's this sinister Oriental world of Chinatown, and it's extremely dated, obviously, but it plays up that angle, that foreignness and strangeness that is part of, to some extent, is part of the city. And it's true, many of these films try to use some kind of, or either the Chinatown angle or some kind of cosmopolitan angle to give a sense of foreign, some kind of exotic quality that you may not be able to get in other cities, like Los Angeles, for instance.
Now, one other thing we have to mention, which I know you had a beautiful paragraph about, which is the weather, especially the fog. That also is a contributing factor in making the directors choose San Francisco to make films, and you to choose to write this book about San Francisco and the film.
Absolutely, and I love the fog, and I'm always frustrated that there aren't more films that make use of the fog. There's one example I can think of is Born to Kill, a film with Lawrence Tierney from 1946, I believe. And there's a beautiful scene shot at night at Ocean Beach, or what's supposed to be Ocean Beach. Although you don't see the water, it's just on the sand dunes, and there's a fog sweeping through under the street lamp, and sand is blowing around, and it's very eerie. But there aren't very many examples of films that I can think of that make dramatic use of the fog. You'd expect a lot of these films to have some kind of sinister criminal walking out into out of the fog or into the fog, but there aren't many of them, and maybe it has to do with maybe something hard to film. I don't know, but I always want the fog to be more of a part of it. It's part of the identity of the city, so it works in that way. But it's rare that it's actually part of the film itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned several films. You mentioned The Maltese Falcon. You mentioned Hitchcock's Vertigo. We mentioned Orson Welles' The Lady from Shanghai. and of course Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry, although I guess he wasn't the director of the first one. If you look at their San Francisco film noir films, is there some common theme or element that emerges that combines these very different films because of the use of San Francisco, or is it just a way to fill out our environment, our understanding of the environment in which these directors made these great films?
I think that if you look in certain periods, there's certainly things in common around San Francisco. In the classic period from the 40s and 50s, San Francisco is always this beautiful, glamorous city, and they make as much of that as possible. Mm-hmm. And I mean, really, most of them begin with a shot from on top of Twin Peaks, just a panorama of the city. Sometimes it's moving right to left, sometimes it's left to right, sometimes it doesn't move at all, and then it goes into the scene itself. And many of these films also, hilariously, have a narrator who introduces the viewer to the city as if they'd never heard of it before. Mm-hmm. So explaining that San Francisco is the 12th biggest American city, and really silly primers on the city as if it was something that was unknown to the viewers. But if you try to compare the films from that era to the 70s, it becomes very difficult. In fact, there's more, I think, in common with films in the 80s and 90s with the earlier age. And the 70s tend to focus on a different San Francisco, and this grittier San Francisco that we were talking about, where the city is no longer as majestic as it once was. And it's very much about the decline of the American city and the decrepitude of it. But in the 80s and 90s, you see a very nostalgic return to the way San Francisco appears in those earlier films. And there is a nostalgic quality, and often many of those films like Basic Instinct or Twisted is another Phil Kaufman film that came out last year, even Final Analysis, very consciously look back at those earlier films, especially Vertigo, and revisit them to the point almost of mimicry and imitation. Jade is another example. So I feel like that there is unity at both ends, but in the middle there was this period which produced often really many of the best films, the most interesting films of the bunch, where it became something else, and the directors who had come of age watching these films when they were young in the 40s and 50s wanted to take it to some other level and to do something different, but using the same themes, and made more extreme films in a certain way, and films where they emphasized these certain qualities of noir until they became almost unrecognizable. And then in the 80s and 90s, it sort of conforms back to the original.
Mm-hmm. How many movies do you cover in your book?
41.
And I would think that most of them you couldn't go out and check out the video store. So how did you do the research for this?
Well,
you watched them all.
I watched them all. I watched many more than 41. I watched many films that were set in San Francisco but weren't actually filmed there. Mm-hmm. And there's a period, especially in the 40s, early 40s, where it was considered low class to shoot on location if you're a studio that could afford to make beautiful sets, mm-hmm. use backdrops. And in fact, the Maltese Falcon and Out of the Past, which are maybe the two most famous San Francisco noirs, were not shot on location at all, and they used some stock footage of the city. But for some of the more obscure films, I relied on this excellent nonprofit group called the Danger and Despair Knitting Circle, which is a group of mostly film collectors and noir addicts and experts who are based in San Francisco, and they have their goal is to create virtually a comprehensive library of all of noir, and they have something like 800 titles, and they made a bunch of them available to me, including some of the films like Treasure of Monte Cristo, Chinatown at Midnight, No Escape, which you can't find in any real copy as far as I know. And many of these films are very cheap productions, Poverty Row productions, and are often very silly and strange, but for that are also are also extremely interesting and funny, especially Chinatown at Midnight with an actor named Herb Hatfield, who some consider to be the worst actor of all time.
I see.
And so, which maybe makes him one of the best. I don't know, but it was through them I got to see a lot of these films, and that was exciting. And anyone can go to their website and order them as well.
Mm-hmm. And you actually keep your sense of humor as you write this book and give it to us, because there are times where it's pretty hilarious. I remember, and you're commenting on it, some of the anti-communist movies where we moved from the sinister quality of the mob or the evil woman to the communist menace without blinking an eye.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these films are hilarious, and if you go to screenings of them at noir festivals or elsewhere, often the response that you see most often in the audience is laughter, and some people feel bad about it because the movies themselves often take themselves very seriously, but a lot of them are ridiculous and really strange, and a lot of the dialogue is so off the wall, and I think it's important to keep a sense of humor about a lot of these films because that's much of the fun about them. There's really been a resurgence of books in the last, or not resurgence, but just an explosion of books in the last 5 or 10 years about noir, and many of them are written as really scholarly texts and take everything very seriously and try to codify it in a way that I don't particularly find appealing, and I think it's important to understand the fun of these films as well and to enjoy that too.
Well, one thing that's not fun, that is somewhat dark, and I would like for you to comment on, is the role of women in these films, because they are a source of the evil, as you suggested
often,
earlier.
Yeah.
Often, not always, but often. Leading, I'm thinking of Rita Hayworth in Lady of Shanghai, which I just saw. Also, more of an innocent, but in Vertigo, Madeline, the Kim Novak character who leads Jimmy Stewart as part of a plot, but then changes in the course of the film. Talk a little about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Even there in Vertigo, where the Kim Novak character originally appears as a victim, or at least a victim at least of a mental illness, perhaps, or maybe being haunted by a ghost, turns into a character who is very much intentionally led Scotty Stewart's character into this web, and becomes very sinister and nasty in her way, and she's really blamed, I think, for a lot of what happens, and it's true of a lot of Rita Hayworth in Lady from Shanghai is maybe the most evil femme fatale of all of these, because she's so cold-hearted, and at the end she's just so evil, and that might have to do with Wells and Hayworth's marriage at the time was crumbling, and many people point to that as the reason why he made her so nasty in that film. There are some examples of films where the female is the main character and is the noir hero and is treated sympathetically. There are certainly not as many, and the archetype is a male, often an ex-soldier or a private eye. But there are some great films. One is Mildred Pierce with Joan Crawford, which is not in the book. It's not San Francisco. But another one that Joan Crawford is in is Sudden Fear, where she's led in by a male fatale, I guess, Jack Palance character, who's this very bizarre actor who is really playing a part in a similar way. So it is an unfortunate thing about many of these films, and it is something that's even carried over into films in the 80s and 90s, films like Basic Instinct and Jade, and not all of these are excellent films, but they do use that same prototype, and it reflects, I think, something about American culture in the 40s and 50s. But you'd like to see, and today, but you'd like to see more films, since the films are all about subversion and subverting norms in American society at the time. One would like to see more females have more sympathetic or heroic roles, but they're few and far between. But there have been noir festivals that have focused only on the films where the females are the noir heroes. But usually those films are reserved for the Barbara Stanwicks and Joan Crawfords, and it's very rare that someone who is not of that caliber or renown at the time would get any of these kinds of roles.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is it about a work like yours that, in what way do you see it furthering the audience's appreciation of this genre? Is it by filling out this subset and the story of the subset? Do you have a goal there, or are you trying to make them tourists to San Francisco?
No, well, there's several different goals, I suppose. The main one was, it was a subject that I thought was fun and I thought was interesting, and it was a great way to learn more about film noir and San Francisco and films and all of that. So I don't know if when I wrote it, if I had in mind, if I was trying to entertain any particular audience or inform them or anything, but it was more just to understand why so many films have been made in the city. What is it about San Francisco that attracts these films, and trying to understand the qualities of San Francisco that attracted me to it, and what makes it a beautiful yet mysterious and strange place, and what is it that fascinates me about the city, because I think on some level that what fascinated me about the city is what fascinates me in some ways about the film, that it is a kind of otherworldly place where strange things can happen. And I tried to write about that as well, but yeah, more tactfully. Like there were sort of three goals, and one was the travel guide aspect to it. One is a historical guide to the city and the city's darker past, and then the third is a critical overview of the whole genre of film noir as seen through these 41 films, because I think they are representative of the way that the genre as a whole has evolved over these 50-some years since it began. I'm
curious, when I've talked to directors in the past, people who do movies, they this notion of film as a dream world comes again and again. And I'm curious, what is it about being in this dream world, but then seeing something that's actually real? Because I know that when I see a movie, and I'm generalizing from my experience, but I think other people, and there's something in the movie that you see other than the star, it somehow grounds it in a reality that lets you absorb the dream. Is that fair? Is that what's going on? Why you go through quite a listing of all the buildings, with the addresses and so on, and I think you're right about it. Why are you right about people wanting that?
Well, it is always an interesting thing to me, because I've never been that interested in seeing real locations from films, and yet that's very much part of what the book is about. But I try to include locations from these, and maybe I should explain that each chapter pairs a film with a location from the film. I try to choose locations and places around the city that feel very much part of this dream world of film noir in particular. And so many of the sites aren't common tourist sites or even buildings at all, but empty gaps in the urban grid, and lots and places where buildings once existed, or places where there used to be something interesting but it's now changed in another way. And that's something that gets more to the nature of what fascinates me about cities, especially American cities, where there's so much renewal constantly and so much rebuilding. And it's always fascinating for me to see little places where you can detect part of the city's past that still remains. And you don't have that in Europe, for instance, where you're walking amid the ruins, in a place like Rome. But in San Francisco and in other American cities, where you can find little places in the city that brings back something of its past, I always find that beautiful in a way. And there are some remarkable examples in San Francisco, one that jumps out at me is the the ruins of the Sutro Baths, which was this enormous Crystal Palace-like structure in the cove under the Cliff House, and it appeared in the lineup. I have it as once it had become an ice skating rink because the swimming pools had fallen out of favor, mostly because they were really freezing because they used ocean water. And shortly after the lineup, that's 1958, the whole palace caught on fire and burned to the ground, and the owners collected lots of insurance money and left the country, and it's this very shady noir-like dealing. And the ruins remain, and they never clean them up, and it's now part of the Parks Department. And you can go and walk along these fallen columns, and you can still see the outline of the swimming pool, which was the largest swimming pool, I think, in the country, if not the world at the time. And it's very strange. So there are some moments that are some places that are exciting to me as they have their own noir history, and then they fit into the films themselves, and they remain to this day this kind of place in between the city and its past that doesn't fit in either one clearly. And I love those places in San Francisco. San Francisco seems to have a lot of places like that, in fact.
Two things are striking. One is that in your book you write very good descriptions of some of these places, both from the film and from the way they are now. And you just suggested that doing that is part of a rendering of the history of San Francisco and not just of the film.
Yeah, but it's really an alternate history of the city. It's not the kind of history you would read in a book about San Francisco's history, but this forgotten history. And I think that's what's interesting is I tried to create, or at least reveal, a kind of other San Francisco, a noir San Francisco that is there if you look for it, but you have to look for it, and you see it in these films. And it works because noir, unlike, if I had done romantic comedies in San Francisco or musicals in San Francisco or something like that, they choose different locations, and that's something I discovered as I was going about doing the book. Noir, since it's very much about the subversion of the outer reality of the city, they focus on strange places, out-of-the-way places, alleyways and abandoned buildings and decrepit theaters, things like that, Sutro Baths. They often do, when they do focus on a tourist landmark, such as Union Square in the conversation, they render it, or especially Ocean Beach in Born to Kill, they render it almost unrecognizable, and it becomes something else altogether, so that you might not even recognize it when you go to it. I've had people who have read the book and mentioned that they didn't realize, and obviously they're not from San Francisco, but they didn't realize that the conversation, that scene was set in Union Square, and it seems so obvious, but at the same time it's part of what a lot of these films do, which is render unrecognizable these places in the city that we know as these major landmarks. So I think simply by listing these locations, you get at what noir is trying to do and the way it works with the architecture of these cities, especially San Francisco.
So one final question, and I guess that would be, so what is your favorite film noir set in San Francisco, and why?
Well, I think my favorite San Francisco film period would probably be Vertigo, and the city is in that picture. Hitchcock set out to make, he called it a Valentine to San Francisco. He loved San Francisco, and the city is rendered so beautifully in that, and its color. It's one of these first films that I think you could consider noir, but were shot in color, but the color itself is shot in this type of film called Vista Vision, and it's almost spooky. There's a spooky quality to it because it seems ethereal, almost ghostly, which ties into what the story of the film, which is in many ways a ghost story. And so it's a beautiful. The city looks beautiful in it. The Golden Gate looks really bright red, and the water is emerald, and it's gorgeous. And yet you still have this feeling that everything is not quite right. That maybe it's too nice, or or there's a ghostly quality to it. And so I think that's the film I would have to point to, and it's also one of the films that got me excited about this in the first place, and from one of my favorite films from a very early age. But if you looked in the classic era, I'd also mention Woman on the Run with Anne Sheridan, which is a female hero, which is a very touching, moving story, but also very dark and very creepy in a way. And of more recent films, or at least the next era, I would also say Point Blank, which the first scene and the last scene are set in San Francisco, but the rest of it goes to LA. But there again, those scenes are set in Alcatraz and at Fort Point, and those two buildings take on very haunted, mysterious qualities, and they seem very much urban ruins in the way that the Sutro baths are now, and renders them completely unrecognizable and strange, foreboding especially.
Well, on that note, Nat, I want to thank you very much, and I want to show the audience your book again, San Francisco Noir, and it's cram-packed with information beyond what we've discussed here. So I recommend it, and thanks very much for joining us, and good luck at the Paris Review.
Thank you very much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.